In March 1969, a disused cinema in Southampton became a shop selling paint, timber, and nails. Nobody there thought they were building an empire. Richard Block and David Quayle worked 60-hour weeks behind that counter, repaying their bank overdraft within 6 months. Around them, an entire generation of British DIY chains would rise on the same promise. Texas Home Care, Do It All, Great Mills, Focus, Home Base, each one, at some point, bigger, flashier, better funded. One by one, over 5 decades, every single one of them closed its doors for the last time. Home Base, the last of the great rivals, fell only last year. B&Q is still standing. How does a shop built from a converted cinema outlast every competitor that ever tried to beat it? Through recessions, private equity raids, and the death of the British high street itself? This is the story of the DIY chain that simply refused to disappear. In 1969, Britain was a nation still living with the housing stock of an older world. Terraced streets, post-war prefabs, and homes that badly needed modernizing, but a home improvement culture that barely existed. If you wanted to fix a door hinge, repaint a fence, or lay new flooring, your options were limited. A builder's merchant that spoke a trade language you didn't understand, or a small hardware shop with a fraction of what you actually needed, open only until 5:30 and closed all day Sunday. Home improvement was something professionals did. For the ordinary family, it simply wasn't accessible. Richard Block and David Quayle were brothers-in-law, not tradesmen by background. Quayle had spent the 1960s working at the Marley Tile Company, learning the building supplies trade from the inside, while Block brought the drive to strike out alone. What they shared was a simple observation. Across parts of Europe, a new kind of retail format was already taking hold. Large warehouse-style stores where anyone, professional or amateur, could walk in, see everything laid out in front of them, and buy it there and then, no trade account required. Nothing like it existed in Britain yet. In March 1969, the two men found their opportunity in Southampton, a disused furniture warehouse on Portswood Road, previously home to a cinema, standing empty and unremarkable. There was no grand unveiling. They fitted it out themselves, stacked the shelves themselves, and opened the doors under the name Block and Quayle. The idea was deceptively simple. Longer opening hours than any hardware shop in the area, a far broader range of products under one roof, and prices ordinary families could afford without haggling or trade discounts. For the first time, someone building a garden fence on a Saturday afternoon or replacing a bathroom tap on a Sunday morning had somewhere to go. The name didn't last as written. Delivery notes and invoices, filled in quickly by staff and suppliers alike, had already started abbreviating Block and Quayle down to 2 letters. Rather than fight it, the founders adopted it. B&Q was born not from a marketing meeting, but from the shorthand of their own paperwork. Behind the counter, the work was relentless. Block and Quayle each put in 60-hour weeks, 6 days at a time, doing much of the physical labor themselves in those earliest months, unloading deliveries, serving customers, balancing the books late into the evening. The bank overdraft that had funded the fit-out was repaid within 6 months. It was a signal that the format worked, that people wanted what B&Q was offering, and that Southampton shoppers were prepared to travel for it. Within 5 years, turnover had reached £1 million. Extraordinary growth for a business that had started with 2 men, an empty warehouse, and no formal retail experience between them. What made B&Q different in those first years wasn't scale, it was access. For the first time, DIY wasn't gate-kept behind trade counters and professional accounts. It belonged to whoever walked through the door. But a single shop on Portswood Road was never going to be the end of the story. Within a decade, B&Q would begin the transformation from one converted warehouse into a nationwide name, and the first cracks in the old British high street would already be forming beneath it. By the mid-1970s, that first shop on Portswood Road had stopped being an experiment and become a template. Word traveled the way it always did in provincial England, through neighbors comparing notes over garden fences, through tradesmen who'd started buying their materials there, because the prices beat the builder's merchant down the road. B&Q didn't need to explain itself twice. Once people had walked the aisles, seen paint, timber, tools, and fittings all under one roof, all priced for a family rather than a firm. They didn't go back to the old way of doing things. Richard Block left the company in 1976, stepping away from the business he'd built with his brother-in-law, just as it was gathering real momentum. It was Quayle who carried the expansion forward through the back half of the decade, and by 1979, B&Q had grown from a single Southampton warehouse to 26 stores scattered across the country. For a business that had started with two men repaying a bank overdraft by working 60-hour weeks, that was no small achievement. It was proof that the format could travel, that what had worked in Southampton could work in Leeds, in Bristol, in towns that had never had anything like it before. And Britain, in those years, was ready for it. The country was living through a quiet revolution in how people thought about their own homes. The 1970s brought a wave of home improvement enthusiasm that hadn't existed a generation earlier. Avocado bathroom suites, patterned wallpaper, fitted kitchens replacing scullery-style cooking spaces, families finally able to reshape post-war housing stock into something that felt like their own. Where their parents had called in a tradesman for anything beyond the simplest repair, this generation wanted to do it themselves, and B&Q had arrived at precisely the moment that appetite was forming. A Saturday trip to B&Q became something close to ritual for households across the country. Fathers wandered the timber aisles, weighing up which shelving would fit the alcove in the lounge. Mothers picked out paint swatches for a child's bedroom being redone for the first time since the war. Whole families loaded estate cars with fence panels, bags of cement, coils of rope and hosepipe, planning out a weekend's work over a flask of tea in the car park before they'd even got the boot shut. It wasn't glamorous. It didn't need to be. What B&Q offered was permission. Permission for ordinary people to take charge of their own homes without needing a trade account or a professional's blessing. What was it exactly about wandering those long aisles of timber and paint tins that made a Saturday feel like it had purpose? For many families, it wasn't really about the shelving or the fence panel at all. It was the sense, however small, of building something with your own hands in a country that was only just learning to believe ordinary people could. The growth that had carried B&Q from one shop to 26 did not go unnoticed. At the beginning of the 1980s, the F.W. Woolworth Company came calling, and B&Q was sold for $16.8 million, a substantial sum for a business not yet 15 years old. David Quayle sold his share in the deal, stepping away in 1982 with a personal fortune of some £4 million, a remarkable outcome for a man who'd once worked 60-hour weeks behind a counter in a converted cinema. Neither founder remained to see what came next. Ownership shifted again barely 2 years later, when Woolworth's UK operations, B&Q included, were acquired by a company called Paternoster. It was an unglamorous, almost bureaucratic name for what would prove to be one of the most consequential corporate transformations in British retail history. Paternoster would soon rename itself Kingfisher plc, and Kingfisher would remain B&Q's parent company for the rest of its story, the institutional backbone behind everything the brand became, for better and for worse. For the customers loading up their estate cars on a Saturday afternoon, none of this boardroom activity meant very much. The shelves were still stocked, the prices were still fair, the staff still knew where the wood screws were kept. But the business that Block and Quayle had built with their own hands, unloading their own deliveries into the small hours, no longer belonged to either of them. It belonged now to a corporate parent with ambitions far larger than a single warehouse in Southampton. Ambitions that would take B&Q from 26 stores to something approaching national dominance, and would in time expose it to risks the two founders had never had to face. The golden era of B&Q as a scrappy independent was over almost before most of its customers had noticed it beginning. What came next was expansion on a scale neither Block nor Quayle could have imagined from behind that first counter. And with it, the opening moves of a rivalry that would define British DIY retail for the next 50 years. Under Kingfisher's ownership, B&Q stopped behaving like a regional success story and started behaving like a national ambition. The 26 stores Quayle had left behind in 1982 were only the beginning. Through the rest of the 1980s, Kingfisher poured capital into the format that had worked so well in Southampton, opening new warehouses in town after town, county after county, until B&Q's orange signage became as familiar a fixture of the British retail landscape as the supermarkets people did their weekly shop in. That color change was deliberate, and it marked a turning point in how B&Q presented itself to the country. The original black and red livery gave way to a bold corporate orange, a choice that made the stores instantly recognizable from a passing motorway, but one that also created a persistent misunderstanding among shoppers. The new orange branding looked strikingly similar to an American chain called Home Depot, and for years afterwards, customers on both sides of the Atlantic assumed the two companies were connected, perhaps even part of the same parent group. They weren't. B&Q had arrived at that orange independently, chasing visibility on Britain's high streets and retail parks, not chasing any resemblance to a rival 3,000 miles away. Kingfisher's ambitions for B&Q went further than paint and signage, though. In the 1980s, the company experimented with an idea that, on paper, looked like the future of British retail. Three complementary store formats built side by side, sharing a single car park. Alongside the DIY warehouse itself, B&Q rolled out home centers, selling furniture and household goods in auto centers, catering to Britain's growing car culture with parts and accessories. The logic was straightforward. Get a family into one retail park on a Saturday and give them three separate reasons to empty their wallets before they left. A new kitchen worktop from the DIY store, a sofa from the home center, a set of car mats from the auto center, all without moving the car. It was an ambitious bet, and not every part of it survived contact with reality. The home centers and auto centers experiment would not become the permanent shape of B&Q's business, but it revealed something important about the company at this stage of its life: a willingness to test new formats, to risk capital on ideas that might not work, and to learn quickly from the ones that didn't. That instinct, to experiment without becoming reckless, would matter far more than anyone realized at the time, especially once rivals began making very different choices with their own money. Growth for B&Q wasn't confined to Britain's borders either. In 1995, the company opened its first overseas subsidiary in Taiwan, and by January 1996, its first large home improvement center had opened in Taoyuan City, a genuine international outpost for a business that, barely a quarter century earlier, had been a single converted cinema in Southampton. It was a modest international footprint compared to what some retailers were attempting elsewhere in the world, but it signaled something about how far the company's confidence had grown. B&Q was no longer simply Britain's answer to the hardware shop. It was beginning to think of itself as an export, a British retail format good enough to work somewhere else entirely. None of this expansion happened in a vacuum, of course. Every new B&Q store that opened in a market town or retail park was also, quietly, a threat to somebody else. The independent ironmonger who couldn't match the range, the local builder's merchant who couldn't match the opening hours. And B&Q itself was no longer the only warehouse-style operator chasing the same customers. Other names were entering the same race, building their own orange and blue and green and white versions of the same idea. And by the time the 1980s gave way to the 1990s, what had once been an open field was becoming a genuine, three-way contest for Britain's home improvement pound. The machine Kingfisher had built was working. Stores were multiplying, formats were diversifying, borders were being crossed. But every expansion machine eventually meets resistance. And for B&Q, that resistance was about to arrive not from failure, but from success. The very growth that had made British DIY retail so profitable was drawing in competitors hungry for the same prize, and the coming decade would decide, once and for all, which of them Britain's home improvement culture actually belonged to. By the 1990s, B&Q was no longer just a shop people visited. It had become a fixture of the British weekend, as embedded in the national rhythm as Sunday lunch or the football results coming in on the radio. Saying you were popping to B&Q needed no further explanation to anyone in the country. It meant paint tins in the boot, a trip to the timber aisle, a Saturday morning given over to some small act of home improvement. Few retailers managed to become part of a nation's vocabulary. By this point, B&Q had. That familiarity was built in part on a very British trait, an increasing pride in doing it yourself rather than paying someone else to do it for you. Where an earlier generation had called in a tradesman for anything beyond changing a light bulb, their children had grown up watching their own parents wallpaper a bedroom or build a garden shed with materials bought from precisely this kind of warehouse store. B&Q hadn't just sold products into that culture, it had helped create it, store by store, decade by decade, until DIY stopped being a niche hobby and became something close to a national pastime. But B&Q was not fighting for that culture alone. By the early 1990s, the British home improvement market had sharpened into a genuine three-way contest, and each of the major players had worked out, with surprising precision, exactly who they were trying to sell to. Homebase Up positioned itself around what the industry at the time described as a softer, more female-friendly image. A store you could bring the whole family to, browsing homeware and garden furniture as much as fence panels and cement. Wix, by contrast, planted its flag firmly with the serious DIYer and the working tradesman, a store that spoke the language of the professional rather than the weekend hobbyist. B&Q chose neither lane exclusively, and that refusal to specialize turned out to be its greatest strength. Rather than narrowing itself to one type of customer, B&Q built its identity around scale and accessibility. The widest range, the most locations, prices low enough that both the amateur homeowner and the working builder found a reason to walk through the door. It was a strategy that looked, on paper, less distinctive than its rivals. In practice, it meant B&Q wasn't competing for a slice of the market. It was absorbing all of it. That position showed up in the numbers that mattered most. By the 1990s, B&Q stood as the largest home improvement retailer in the country, ahead of both Homebase and Wix, in a sector where the difference between first and second place was measured in hundreds of stores and millions of customers making the same Saturday morning choice. Every fence panel sold, every tin of paint carried out to a waiting car, was a small vote for one format over another. And more of those votes, week after week, were landing with B&Q than with anyone else. What none of B&Q's rivals could easily see at the time was that popularity of this kind carries its own quiet danger. A market this profitable, this embedded in national life, does not stay uncontested for long. Success invites imitators, and imitators invite price wars, acquisitions, and increasingly desperate bets from companies determined not to be left behind. Was B&Q's dominance in the 1990s built to last? Or was it simply the calm before a decade in which nearly everyone else in this market would gamble and lose? That question would not stay theoretical for long. Within a few short years, the same three-way rivalry that had defined the golden age of British DIY retail would begin to fracture. Not because customers stopped wanting fence panels and paint tins, but because new competitors, new pricing pressure, and new corporate ownership were about to test which of these companies had actually built something durable and which had simply built something popular. By the middle of the 1990s, the first names began to disappear from Britain's home improvement landscape, quietly, without much fanfare, the way most retail deaths actually happen. Texas Home Care, once a recognizable fixture on high streets and retail parks across the country, was folded into Homebase in January 1995, its identity absorbed rather than destroyed outright. It wouldn't be the last name to vanish that decade. Do It All and Champion, two more chains that had spent years fighting for the same DIY-minded customers, fell away not long after, victims of a market that had simply stopped having room for so many similar shops chasing the same weekend shopper. For the ordinary customer, none of this registered as crisis. A shop closing here, a rebrand there. These were the kind of quiet changes that barely interrupted a Saturday morning routine. But for anyone watching the industry closely, the pattern was unmistakable. The DIY boom of the 1970s and 1980s had drawn in far more competitors than the British market could actually sustain, and the culling had begun. Weaker chains, undercapitalized or poorly positioned, were the first to go. B&Q, still comfortably ahead of Homebase and Wix, watched this first wave of closures from a position of relative safety. But safety in retail is rarely permanent. The deeper threat wasn't coming from within the DIY sector at all. It was coming from outside it, from retailers who had never built their business around home improvement, but had noticed, quite correctly, how much money there was to be made in it. Tesco, already Britain's dominant grocery chain, began stocking a reliable range of DIY basics at prices that undercut B&Q's own. Paint, tools, garden supplies, sold not as a specialism, but as an afterthought within a supermarket trip customers were making anyway. It was a direct challenge to the very foundation of B&Q's pricing strategy, the low-cost mass-market position the company had spent 2 decades building. At the same time, IKEA was carving out dominance in categories B&Q had always assumed were its own: kitchens, lighting, storage solutions, wrapped in a shopping experience that felt more modern, more design-conscious than a traditional builder's warehouse. Where B&Q sold the raw materials for a home improvement project, IKEA increasingly sold the finished vision, flat-packed and ready to assemble, appealing to a customer who wanted the result without quite so much of the sawdust and mess in between. New entrants kept arriving too. Specialist retailers like Floors to Go carved out narrow niches with focused ranges and aggressive pricing, while private equity money began circling the sector, drawn by the same profitability that had made it attractive to Tesco and IKEA in the first place. What had once been an open field and then a clean three-way contest between B&Q, Homebase, and Wikis was becoming something far messier. A market under attack from every direction at once, with new competitors who didn't play by the same rules the original DIY warehouses had established. How long could a business built on being the biggest, broadest, most accessible option in a simple three-way race actually survive, once the race itself had changed shape entirely? B&Q's answer in these years was to keep pushing on scale and price rather than retreat into a narrower identity the way some of its struggling rivals eventually would. It was a strategy that would prove more resilient than it looked from the outside. But resilience was about to be tested by something far more dangerous than a supermarket's paint aisle or a Swedish flat-pack showroom. Because the real damage of the coming years would not be inflicted by outside competitors at all. It would come from within the DIY sector itself, from the corporate decisions, the leveraged buyouts, and the desperate acquisitions that B&Q's own rivals were about to make in a scramble to keep pace. The chains that survived the first cull of the 1990s were not out of danger. In some ways, the worst was still ahead of them. The first genuinely reckless decision of this era belonged not to B&Q, but to Focus. In 2000, the company acquired Wikis, B&Q's old tradesman-focused rival, bringing two very different DIY identities under one corporate roof. On paper, it looked like consolidation, a sensible response to a market that could no longer support so many separate chains. In practice, it created a business trying to serve two incompatible customers at once: Wikis' serious tradesmen, who wanted no-nonsense trade pricing and bulk materials, and Focus's general DIY shoppers, who wanted something closer to a friendly, browsable warehouse. Running both formats under one strategy proved far harder than the deal's architects had anticipated. Within a handful of years, the gamble unraveled. Focus sold the Wikis brand and its stores to Travis Perkins in 2004 and 2005 for $950 million, an enormous sum that suggested confidence, but which really reflected a company retreating from an experiment that hadn't worked. Freed from Wix, Focus pressed on alone as a consumer-facing DIY chain, at one point ranking as the second largest home improvement retailer in the country, behind only B&Q itself, with 178 stores and more than 3,000 employees at its peak in 2002. It was, briefly, a genuine contender, but peaks in this industry, as B&Q's own rivals kept proving, arrived shortly before the fall. From 2007 onwards, Focus began recording losses every single year. Rising costs, softening demand, and a debt structure that left little room to absorb a bad trading year all compounded at once. By 2011, the company was losing £25 million annually, a figure no amount of restructuring could quietly absorb. Homebase, meanwhile, was living through its own version of corporate musical chairs. Ownership changed hands again and again through the 2000s. Sold to Schroeder Ventures in December 2000, then to Argos Retail Group in November 2002, folded into Home Retail Group by 2006. Each change of ownership brought a new strategy, A new set of priorities passed down from a boardroom with only a passing interest in what actually happened on the shop floor. For the employees stacking shelves and the customers browsing garden furniture, the brand looked the same from the outside. Underneath, it was a company that had not truly belonged to itself in over a decade. The most damaging decision of all was still to come, and it would not arrive from a private equity firm at all, but from an Australian retail giant convinced it had found the answer nobody else in Britain could see. In January 2016, the Australian conglomerate Wesfarmers purchased Homebase outright, arriving with total confidence in a plan that had worked spectacularly well on the other side of the world. Convert the stores to the format of Bunnings Warehouse, Wesfarmers' dominant Australian hardware chain, and repeat that success on British soil. It was the boldest single wager any company in this industry had made in decades, and it would become one of the most expensive retail failures in modern British history. The strategy assumed that what worked for Australian shoppers in Australian towns with Australian shopping habits would translate cleanly onto the British high street. It didn't. British customers found the reimagined stores unfamiliar, and in many cases, actively worse than the Homebase they'd known for years. Ranges they recognized were stripped out, formats were reshuffled, and the softer, family-friendly identity Homebase had spent 2 decades building was replaced by something that felt imported rather than improved. Sales fell, trust eroded. Within roughly 2 years, Wesfarmers abandoned the experiment entirely, having lost close to £1 billion on a single catastrophic misjudgment of what British shoppers actually wanted from their local DIY store. In August 2018, what remained of Homebase was sold on again, this time to the restructuring specialist Hilco for the token sum of £1, a company once worth hundreds of millions, changing hands for less than the price of a tin of paint. It was less a sale than an admission that the brand, in its current form, had nothing left worth paying for. Focus, for its part, never recovered from the losses that had begun piling up in 2007. And who, watching from a boardroom at any of these companies, genuinely believed their strategy was the one that would fail, right up until the moment the numbers made it impossible to believe anything else? Through all of it, the Wickes divestment, the endless changes of Homebase ownership, the doomed Bunnings experiment, B&Q made no equivalent gamble. It didn't chase a foreign format, didn't load itself with acquisition debt, didn't reinvent its identity every time a new owner arrived with a new theory. Whether that restraint was foresight or simply good fortune, it was about to matter more than anyone at Focus or Homebase could have imagined, because the reckoning for all of this recklessness was now only months away. The end, when it came for Focus, arrived with the particular speed that retail collapses always seem to have, slow for years, then sudden within weeks. On 5th of May 2011, Focus DIY entered administration, and Ernst & Young were appointed to manage what remained of a company that, less than a decade earlier, had stood as the second largest home improvement retailer in the country. The losses that had begun in 2007 had finally overwhelmed everything else. There was no more restructuring left to try, no further owner willing to absorb another year of red ink. What followed was a quiet, methodical dismantling. Of the roughly 178 stores Focus had operated at its peak, 55 were sold off to competitors. B&Q, Wickes, and B&M all took locations, rebranding the shop fronts and absorbing whatever stock and staff came with them. It was in its own way a form of survival for those particular buildings, even if the Focus name attached to them disappeared entirely. The remaining 123 stores were not so fortunate. One by one, through May, June, and into July, they closed their shutters for the final time, until the last of them shut on 22nd July 2011. For the employees behind those counters, the closures rarely came with much warning or ceremony. A store manager might learn on a Tuesday that the doors would not open again after the weekend. Staff who had worked there for years, who knew every regular customer by name and every product on every shelf, found themselves clearing stock rooms and taking down signage for a company that no longer existed. Around 900 jobs were preserved through the sales to B&Q, Wickes, and B&M. A mercy in its way, but one that still meant hundreds more simply ended, without transition, without much public acknowledgement beyond a line in the local paper. For customers in towns where Focus had been the only sizable DIY shop for miles, the closure left a genuine physical gap. Suburban and regional areas that had relied on Focus as their primary access to home improvement retail were left with longer drives to reach a B&Q or a Wickes, if one existed nearby at all. It was a small, unglamorous casualty of the collapse. No dramatic headline, just a longer Saturday morning drive for families who'd never had to think about where their nearest DIY shop was before. The defunct Focus brand itself was picked up by ARHK Designs Ltd., a company that by then also owned the rights to two other dead high street names, Land of Leather and MFI, a trio of British retail casualties gathered under one holding company, kept alive only as intellectual property, never again as working shops. Focus DIY, once a genuine rival to B&Q for the title of Britain's favorite home improvement chain, had become a trademark on a shelf. For B&Q, the collapse of Focus meant something quite different, an opportunity arriving in the most unsentimental way retail opportunities usually do. 31 of the vacated stores were purchased by Kingfisher for $23 million, expanding B&Q's own footprint using the wreckage of a company that a decade earlier had been snapping at its heels for market leadership. It was not gloating, and it was not celebration. Simply the ordinary mechanics of a market correcting itself, with one company's failure becoming another's expansion plan. Homebase's ending, when it finally arrived, was slower and in some ways sadder. Not the abrupt shock of administration, but a long, visible decline that customers could watch happening in real time, store by store, over the better part of a decade. The catastrophic Bunnings experiment of 2016 to 2018 had already stripped away much of the goodwill the brand had spent 2 decades building, and the token one-horn sale to Hilco in August 2018 marked the moment Homebase stopped being a company anyone expected to thrive, and became instead a company simply trying not to disappear too quickly. It didn't work in the end. Through the early 2020s, Homebase stores closed in slow, uneven waves. A location here shuttered and turned into flats. A location there left standing empty for months before somebody found a new use for the building. Longtime customers, the kind who had been driving to the same Homebase for 20 or 30 years, found the shelves thinner on each visit, the staff fewer, the range narrower than it had been the year before. There was no single dramatic closing day for most of them to point to, just the slow realization over several visits that the local Homebase wasn't quite the shop it used to be, and then, eventually, wasn't there at all. By 2025, that slow fade reached its conclusion. Homebase, the last of B&Q's great 20th century rivals, collapsed entirely, bringing to an end a rivalry that had defined British home improvement retail since the 1990s, when Homebase had marketed itself around a softer, family-friendly image, built specifically to differ from B&Q's mass market scale. 50 years after Texas Home Care, Do It All and Champion had been the first names to disappear, and 14 years after Focus had gone the same way, the last serious competitor B&Q had ever faced was gone too. What remained on Britain's high streets and retail parks was a single name where there had once been half a dozen. The car parks that used to be divided between B&Q, Homebase, Wickes, Focus, Texas, and Do It All, each one drawing its own share of Saturday morning shoppers, had narrowed over 5 decades down to essentially one serious survivor and a handful of specialist trade chains occupying the margins. For a generation of British shoppers who remembered choosing between 2 or 3 different DIY stores depending on mood, budget, or which parent was doing the driving that weekend, the change had crept up on them so gradually that most could no longer say exactly when it had happened. It was not a single collapse that ended this era of British retail. It was 5 decades of them, one company at a time, each failure quietly reshaping what remained of the market until only one name from the original contest was left standing. What remained standing in the aftermath belonged unmistakably to B&Q. By 2023, the company was operating 316 shops across the United Kingdom and Ireland, with a presence stretching as far as Guernsey, Jersey, the Isle of Man, and even Saudi Arabia. A footprint built not through a single decisive masterstroke, but through 5 decades of decisions that were, individually, almost boringly sound. Revenue for the 2022-23 financial year reached $3.8 billion, with net income of $603 million and a workforce of some 27,000 people kept the lights on and the shelves stocked across the country. These were not the numbers of a company that had simply gotten lucky. They were the numbers of a company that had quietly outlasted an entire generation of rivals. The lesson sitting underneath those figures had less to do with brilliance than with restraint. Where Focus gambled on acquiring Wix and then unwound that gamble within a few years, B&Q largely stayed within its own lane, growing the format that had worked in Southampton in 1969 rather than reinventing itself every time a new opportunity appeared. Where Homebase changed owners 5 times in 2 decades, each new parent company arriving with its own theory about what the brand should become, B&Q remained under Kingfisher's stewardship for over 40 years. Stability that gave the business room to make long-term decisions rather than desperate short-term ones dictated by whichever private equity firm currently held the debt. And where Wesfarmers tried to graft an Australian format wholesale onto British shopping habits, convinced that what worked in Perth would work in Preston, B&Q never attempted anything so reckless with its own identity. It adapted around the edges, new store formats, a stronger online presence, small format shops appearing inside supermarkets and on high streets, without ever gambling the whole business on an idea imported from somewhere else. That discipline extended to how the company treated its own physical estate. While Focus and Homebase in their final years became visibly thinner on the shelves and threadbare in appearance, the kind of decline regular customers could see for themselves, visit after visit, B&Q maintained its stores as places people still wanted to walk into. It is a detail that sounds almost too simple to matter, and yet it was precisely the kind of unglamorous, ongoing investment that struggling rivals had quietly stopped making once the balance sheets grew difficult. Presentable shelves, well-stocked aisles, and reliable opening hours don't make headlines. They do, over 5 decades, make the difference between a company that survives and one that doesn't. None of this is to say B&Q never faced real threats. The same pressures that killed off Texas Home Care, Do It All, Champion, Focus, and eventually Homebase, supermarket incursion into DIY basics, IKEA's dominance in kitchens and storage, the rise of online retail, the slow erosion of the British high street itself, pressed on B&Q just as hard as they pressed on everyone else. The difference was never that B&Q faced less competition. It was that B&Q, decision after decision, made fewer of the catastrophic choices that turned manageable pressure into terminal decline elsewhere. There is also a harder truth underneath the survival story, one that B&Q's own success cannot entirely soften. Every closure that expanded B&Q's footprint, the 31 Focus stores absorbed in 2011, the market share inherited as Homebase faded through the 2020s, represented a community somewhere losing a familiar shop, a local employer, a Saturday morning routine built around a place that no longer existed. B&Q's survival did not happen in isolation from those losses. In some real sense, it happened because of them. One struggling competitor's failure becoming another quarter's growth on B&Q's own balance sheet. What does it mean, then, for a British high street when competition itself starts to disappear? When the choice between 3 or 4 familiar DIY shops narrows, town by town, down to essentially one? A single company enduring where 6 once competed is, by any conventional measure, a business success story. But it is also, quietly, the story of an entire retail ecosystem shrinking to fit inside one surviving name. And whether that concentration serves the next generation of British shoppers as well as genuine competition once did, remains a question nobody in this industry has fully answered. Somewhere in Britain this Saturday morning, someone is loading fence panels into the boot of a car, in a car park that has looked almost exactly the same for 50 years. The smell hasn't changed. Sawdust and fresh-cut timber, the faint chemical sweetness of tins of paint stacked 10 high, the cold air that always seems to hang around the outdoor garden section no matter the season. Somewhere else, further down that same high street, or on the edge of some retail park that used to hold 3 or 4 DIY shops instead of one, there is a gap where a different smell used to live. The particular, half-remembered scent of a Focus, a Do-It-All, a Homebase that isn't there anymore. It is worth pausing for a moment on what actually survived here, because it is easy to mistake this story for a simple one about winning. B&Q did not outlast Texas Home Care, Do-It-All Champion, Focus and Home Base because it was flashier or because it made some brilliant, decisive move nobody else thought of. It survived because two brothers-in-law working 60-hour weeks behind a counter in a converted Southampton cinema built something honest enough to still be standing 50 years later. And because decade after decade, the people who inherited that business mostly resisted the temptation to gamble it away on something bigger, bolder, or borrowed from somewhere else. That is not a dramatic kind of survival. It rarely makes for a good headline, but it is the only kind that actually lasts. What this story was always really about was never paint tins or fence panels or even market share. It was about a particular kind of permission, the permission an entire generation of British families gave themselves, starting somewhere around 1969, to stop waiting for a tradesman and start fixing things themselves. That permission changed something in how ordinary people related to their own homes. A shelf put up with your own hands, a fence mended before the weather turned, a kitchen retiled over a long weekend, badly in places, proudly nonetheless. None of that required B&Q specifically, but for millions of families, B&Q was where that confidence was bought, one Saturday at a time, alongside a bag of screws and a tin of undercoat. And it was never really B&Q alone that built that culture. Homebase gave it a softer, more approachable face for families who found warehouse aisles a little intimidating. Wicky's gave it credibility with the tradesmen who needed somewhere serious to buy in bulk. Focus, in its brief years as a genuine contender, gave shoppers in towns where B&Q hadn't yet arrived somewhere to go at all. Even the earliest names, Texas Home Care and Do-It-All, however forgotten they are now, were there at the very beginning of this culture, teaching a nation that DIY was something ordinary people could simply decide to do. Competition, while it lasted, made all of them better than any single one of them would have been alone. That competition is largely gone now, and something real went with it. A father driving further than he used to because the DIY shop that used to be 5 minutes from home closed years ago. A shopkeeper somewhere who spent 30 years learning every regular customer's name, only to spend one final week clearing shelves for a company that had already ceased to exist by the time the door shut for good. A high street with one fewer reason to draw people into town on a Saturday morning. None of that is undone by the fact that one name, in the end, kept its lights on. But there is something worth honoring, too, in what did last, in a business that started with an overdraft in a rented warehouse and never once needed to reinvent itself into something unrecognizable to survive. The people who built B&Q and the people who spent their careers stocking its shelves and serving its customers did something quietly difficult in an industry that has claimed almost everyone else who tried it. They kept a promise to be there next Saturday and the one after that for 50 years running. Somewhere tonight, a family's looking at a garden they built themselves, a shed put up over a long weekend, a fence that has held for 15 years because a father once stood in a warehouse aisle deciding which panels to buy. They may never think of B&Q as history. To them, it is simply still there, the way it always has been, the way none of its old rivals managed to be. That in the end is the quietest kind of legacy a shop can leave behind. Not a memorial, but a Saturday morning that never had to end.